Throughout history, legends of a spectral party of hunters have been many. Hunters of gruesome appearance, with mounts as fearsome as demons. These ghostly entities were thought to emerge from the woods, or simply from the air itself, and did not seem to mind who they were bothering in their ethereal quests. These hunts were said to take place in the forests, usually in the stormiest and winteriest months of the year. Any unlucky soul who happened to stumble upon these supernatural hunting parties, these wild hunts as they were known, were thought to be swept up into them and ferried off for hundreds of miles, hostage to the phantom hunters and sometimes forced to become one of them. Legends exist of practitioners of the dark arts and the occult, who tried to join the hunters in an astral form in an effort to evoke the legendary berserker spirit, as seen in the old Vikings. Others would come to believe that these wild hunts were led by the old gods and goddesses of a bygone world, with spirits of the dead visiting the land to bring blessings or curses. Reports exist in many parts of Europe from the 16th century onwards, of people seeing these ghostly parties moving through the woods, congregating on the fringes of their towns or otherwise hunting with devilish fright. In today's video, we'll aim to break down just what the wild hunts were, how they came to influence much of subsequent European superstition and folklore, and what these strange occurrences were thought to have meant in a time long before our own. Wild hunts were thought to have taken place across Central, Western, and Northern Europe, and would be often characterized by a ghostly group of hunters and their hounds. The concept was believed to have been developed on the Germanic mythology by Jacob Grimm in Deutsche Mythology. Of the wild hunts, Grimm would state that it marches as an army and portends the outbreak of war. He also added that in pre-Christian Europe, there existed ideas that the hunt was led by gods and goddesses, and that they brought welfare and blessings, accepting gifts and offerings from the people who lived in these regions. But under the influence of Christianity, the idea of the wild hunt would come to be converted into a solemn march of idols, a pack of horrid spectres that were synonymous with the devil. But whilst Grimm would come to popularize the term wild hunt, the phenomenon appeared to have existed long before in various European regions. In some tellings, the hunters could be seen dormant in the wilderness, or sometimes brazenly beside villages and towns, doing very little to hide themselves from being witnessed. Other reports suggest that the wild hunts were often led by a spectral figurehead, a hunter who could not be mistaken as the pack leader. Whilst accounts differ depending on the source, the pack leader was often thought to be a divine being, a deity of some kind, from a world or time that had come and gone long before. In Germanic legends, Odin himself assumed the position as the pack leader, whereby he was referred to as Master of the Yule. In this, Odin, as this leader of the wild hunt, came to represent a more benign idea of the phenomena, and was thought of as more of a changing of the seasons. Whilst known as Terrifying Ride in Scandinavia, the wild hunt was also thought to be known as Odin's Hunt. The term Odin's Riders was also thought to be common at this time, as well as the term the Ride of Asgard. The idea of Odin would also be supported by Grimm, who interpreted the wild hunt phenomenon as having little to no influence from Christianity, but instead took more from Norse roots. However, whilst he believed that this was Odin, he also suggested that he'd lost his glorious appearance, along with the decline of his belief, and had now been relegated to a more menacing and dreadful semblance. There was also an idea that the leader of the hunt may have been one of the female Norse gods as well, ones that were considered heathen goddesses by the time of Christianity's rise. Other accounts suggest that the pack leader was an elf, or a variation of a dark fairy, those that existed alongside humans in secrecy. In other tellings, the pack leader is simply the spirit of a dead human, one who likely used to be a hunter but had unfinished business on the earth, perhaps fixated, even in death, on a creature it had yet to hunt. To be honest, the list of who this pack leader may have represented is extensive, depending on which region or century of which the wild hunt was spotted, with some pointing to Theodoric the Great, who was the 5th century king of the Ostrogoths, King Charlemagne, King Arthur, various Danish kings, or even biblical characters both good and evil, from Herod, Cain, Gabriel, and the devil himself. Amongst these accounts, it was not uncommon for these unearthly creatures to be seen flying through the winter night sky, often accompanied by the sounds of the howling wind, that which is sometimes associated with the terrifying howls of their demon hounds. To witness a wild hunt was thought to be the prelude of some calamity, either for the individual seeing the mystical hunters or for the town in which they were spotted. Others saw wild hunts as a precursor for an upcoming plague, famine, or even a war, as noted by Grimm. As mentioned, people also believed that their spirit could be hijacked by the wild hunt if they happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, or that the passing party could abduct a person to join the cavalcade, if not, force them on a journey to the underworld or the dreaded fairy kingdom. An old English legend speaks of a witch named Androman, who upon being captured by the authorities, told them that he'd been abducted by the elf queen and taken to her fairy kingdom. Amongst this telling, he would also speak of the queen riding with elven accomplices on white horses through the forest, all under the watchful eye of Satan. Whilst Androman makes no reference to this party of riders being a wild hunt, some might say it does fit the usual description of wraith-like entities striding through the forests. Wild hunts may also have been used to explain why people had gotten lost in the woods, and that instead of simply taking the wrong turn, had instead been abducted by apparitions and forced into some paranormal hunting party. In Germanic folklore, the phenomenon was often referred to as the Raging Army in the southern region, with the term wild hunt being more common in the north. But there is little in the way of idiosyncrasies between the two. Of the pack's leader, Woden, the Germanic form of Odin, usually took precedence, but there are also some accounts of Krampus the Christmas demon also being a culprit in leading the nocturnal army. Funnily enough, there are some ideas that the idea of wild hunts may have been the initial basis for the idea of Santa Claus, an ethereal figure moving through the night. But there exists an abundance of different tales recorded in Germany, most as mentioned pointing to Woden or Odin as being the leader of the pack. However, there also exist accounts of a feminine figure in Holda, the wife of Woden, being the leader instead. A common Germanic tale sees the wild hunt led by Count Hackelberg, or Count Ehrenberg, a count who is cursed to hunt in the wild for eternity because of the bad deeds he committed when he was alive. More specific details are attributed to the individual characters that make up the hunt in Germanic folklore, including the involvement of werewolves that were thought to break into houses and steal food and beer. Horses of the hunt were portrayed as having up to 8 legs, and were usually demonic in appearance and nature. The tales of the wild hunt here usually proceed with a man warning the town to clear the streets, and to get out of town if possible, before the haunted host could arrive. Those who didn't flee would report seeing the host thunder through the town, and were reckless savages, who, more often than not, ended up fighting amongst themselves. In even more bizarre tellings, there is even a dragon involved, who may have been the actual leader of the hunt in a quest to terrify the humans. The motivations of the wild hunt remain unclear, however. But again, some Germanic legends seek to fill the gaps by suggesting the hunt was in pursuit of a female demon, and thus establishing themselves as heroes. But in other accounts, they are menacing in their hunt for a regular human female, usually a young woman. In other versions, there is no prey at all, and the hunt merely exists for the sake of existing. Germanic folklore also tells us that there was usually one brave soul, or foolish soul, who stood up to the wild hunt, and his success in this endeavour is as mixed as you might have imagined. Sometimes he is punished for his arrogance in assuming he could defeat the hunters, but other times he is able to outsmart the hunters by tricking them into hunting something that cannot be found, thus getting them to leave the town and never return. Other accounts see the hero end up joining the hunt, where he is awarded money, gold, or some form of payment for his switching of allegiance. Sometimes though, he is cursed for his lack of loyalty and can only be absolved by a priest or a wizard who can counter the spell. In Old England, the hunts were also referred to as Hurler's Assembly, a likely connection to the legend of Hurler, recorded by the writer Walter Map in the 13th century. The legend speaks of a king named Hurler who attends a dwarf's wedding inside a cave. Upon leaving the cave, he is given a white dog and told that neither he nor his men must dismount from their horses until the dog has done so first. As Hurler and his men journey home, they come across a wanderer who does not recognize the king. Outraged by his ignorance, one of Hurler's men dismounts his horse to confront the man, only to instantly turn to dust. Suddenly more aware of the warning of the white dog, the men travelled onwards, never once even thinking about dismounting until they reached their destination. But upon reaching their destination, the dog refused to dismount, and legends have it King Hurler and his men journeyed on thereafter, forever trapped to their horses for as long as the dog was with them. Legends continue that the apparitions of King Hurler and his doomed men can still be seen riding through the English landscape, having never dismounted, and thus could easily have been identified as a ghostly hunting party, a wild hunt. English legends also speak of Woden's hunt, like in Old German, which once again point to the hunters as being led by or related to Odin. There are also tales as aforementioned as these hunts being led by King Herod or Cain from the Bible, the latter being doomed to walk the earth for eternity and thus somehow settled in the old European woodlands with his unearthly followers. French accounts see the hunts referred to as Familia Heliquini, possibly borrowed from the Middle English legend of the Hurler King. Others associated this Heliquini to the goddess of death, and that it is she who led the procession of ghostly hunters, and not a male figure as usually purported. Other similar characters such as Le Grand Veneur also appear in French folklore, this being a hunter who made the mistake of hunting on a Sunday. For this, he was condemned by God to hunt eternally during the night. Variations of the story also exist in Welsh legends, where the leader of the hunt is said to be Gwen ap Nudd, the Lord of the Dead. In this legend, the Lord of the Dead is followed by a large pack of hounds with blood-red ears, those which may have influenced the Gabriel hounds in Old English folklore, that usually preceded the death of those who witnessed them. German anthropologist Hans-Peter Dürr noted that it is difficult to determine where exactly the wild hunts originated from, and whether the appearances of spectral riders in the night were merely a demonic interpretation of a natural phenomenon, or an ancient ritualistic procession that saw humans being turned into demons. Other ideas propose that wild hunts were simply an early variation of what would become the witch's Sabbath, a far more popular folkloric motif, and one that would permeate the world with real-life consequences. The Peterborough Chronicle, a manuscript from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, details a rather vivid and compelling eyewitness account of a wild hunt in the 12th century, where it is said, "Many men both saw and heard a great number of huntsmen hunting. The huntsmen were black, huge and hideous, and rode on black horses and on black he-goats, and their hounds were jet black, with eyes like saucers and horrible. This was seen in the very deer park of the town of Peterborough, and in all the woods that stretched from that same town to Stamford, and in the night the monks heard them sounding and winding their horns." Reliable witnesses were said to have given the number of huntsmen as 20 or 30, and it is said, in effect, that this went on for 9 weeks, ending at Easter. Reports of wild hunts during this time in England were usually viewed as villainous, and there could be no denial at the time that these weren't aspects of the devil. But by the time of the medieval romances, the wild hunts in England were also adopted into the fairy world, and as we've mentioned earlier with the case of the witch and Roman, wild hunts could have been assimilated into the folklore of fairies. But a Christian rhetoric was often retained, whether this be to vilify the wild hunts as the devil's work, or promote them as a means to scare people into living righteous lives. One account, for example, describes the wild hunt as being made up of a pack of hellhounds, and that these menacing beasts chase and maul men and women who have not been baptized. Scandinavian tales, meanwhile, reserve Odin as the main component for the stories. As mentioned, Odin was usually the leader of the hunt, though in Scandinavian tales he was never actually seen. A typical trait of the wild hunts in these areas was that no one actually saw ghostly apparitions or demonic hounds, but instead only heard the barking of dogs, those thought to be the dogs of Odin. Accounts vary as to the nature of these barks, but it is thought that a wild hunt could be identified by one loud bark followed by a quieter one. When this was heard in the woods, it usually signified the changing of the seasons, but like in other tales, it could also mean war and political unrest. According to some reports, the woods turned silent, and only the barking of dogs could be heard. In Swedish accounts, Odin was thought to have hunted on a Sunday, but after the rise of Christianity and the forbiddance of working on a Sunday, Odin himself was cursed and forced to hunt down and kill supernatural creatures for the rest of time. The Scandinavian account of wild hunts appears to be somewhat more foreboding, in the sense that one does not actually ever see the wild hunt, but only hears it. Wild hunts have also come to influence modern paganism, where those who practice the religion of Wicca believe that the hunt is led by the goddess Hecate. Rituals in the late 1900s saw pagans in Norfolk replicate the wild hunts as a means of losing themselves in the darkness of nature. These processions were thought to have taken place on Halloween, and involved participants scouring through the forest in the day and then doing so again at night in timed competitions. If completed successfully, participants were thought to gain the trust of the woodland spirits, and were awarded with wooden staffs that were cut from the trees. As can be seen, the lore around the wild hunt can very easily be connected to the dead, or dead hunters to be more specific, considering their ghostly appearance seems to be unanimous across all accounts. The notion of the wild hunt would go on to become a popular motif in art, and the continued speculation regarding the nature of this phenomena would go on to spawn many fantastical tales and stories that would either serve as an inspiration for literature or strengthen the folklore surrounding them. As mentioned, amongst many regions, the wild hunt was a sign of some calamity set to befall the town of which it was seen, and thus could have been used to admonish the living and scare them into amending their otherwise sinful ways. But whether a dubious omen or a procession of ghostly warriors led by Odin himself, the power that this image evokes has since made the wild hunt a most curious and fascinating element in both history and folklore. Let me know your thoughts on the wild hunt in the comments below, and as always, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe for more content just like this. Until next time.